The British government just suffered what could be the most devastating legal blow in modern political history in a courtroom packed with journalists and political observers. Supreme Court justices delivered a verdict so explosive that it sent shockwaves through Westminster and beyond. What happened behind those courtroom doors wasn't just another political setback for Keir Starmer. This was a constitutional earthquake that has left the Prime Minister's authority hanging by a thread. The government's actions have been declared unlawful at the highest level of British justice, and the implications are absolutely staggering. This isn't speculation or political spin. This is the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom officially ruling that the government you elected has been operating outside the boundaries of the law. The question everyone is asking right now is simple but terrifying. If the government itself is breaking the law, what does that mean for democracy? What does it mean for you? And most importantly, can Starmer survive this? The answers will shock you to your core. The scene inside the Supreme Court was unlike anything political observers had witnessed in years. As the Chief Justice began reading the judgment, you could hear a pin drop. Government lawyers sat rigid in their seats, knowing full well what was coming. Opposition members leaned forward, barely able to contain their anticipation. And then it happened. The words that will be remembered for generations. The government's actions were declared unlawful, not questionable, not controversial. Unlawful. Let that sink in for a moment. The very people tasked with upholding the law, the people who write the laws that govern your daily life, have been found guilty of breaking those very same laws. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, but the constitutional crisis it creates is even more terrifying. The case centred around decisions made by Starmer's government that legal experts had been warning about for months. Critics had raised alarm bells, insisting that the government was overstepping its authority and trampling on established legal principles, but those warnings were dismissed. Starmer and his inner circle pressed forward, confident in their power, certain they were untouchable. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The Supreme Court didn't just slap the government on the wrist with a minor technical violation. They systematically dismantled the government's legal arguments piece by piece, exposing fundamental flaws in their approach to governance. The judgment was damning, thorough, and utterly devastating. What makes this even more extraordinary is the rarity of such a ruling. Supreme Court decisions of this magnitude don't happen often. When the highest court in the land declares government actions unlawful, it represents a fundamental breakdown in the checks and balances that are supposed to protect democracy. It means that somewhere along the line, the government became so convinced of its own righteousness, so certain of its mandate, that it forgot the basic principle that no one is above the law. Not even the Prime Minister. Not even the government itself. This is what happens when power goes unchecked. This is what happens when arrogance replaces accountability. The immediate political fallout has been nothing short of spectacular. Within hours of the ruling, opposition parties were calling for resignations. Senior ministers who had defended the government's position now find themselves in an impossible situation. Do they stand by decisions that the Supreme Court has ruled unlawful, or do they distance themselves from a Prime Minister whose judgment has been so publicly and definitively rejected? Some have already begun the careful dance of separation, issuing statements that express respect for the court's decision while conspicuously avoiding any mention of support for Starmer. The rats are already eyeing the lifeboats and the ship hasn't even fully started sinking yet, but here's where it gets even more interesting. This isn't just about one bad decision or one policy misstep. The Supreme Court's ruling exposes a pattern of governance that raises serious questions about how Starmer's government operates behind closed doors. Legal experts examining the full judgment have pointed to evidence suggesting that proper legal advice may have been ignored, that constitutional safeguards may have been deliberately bypassed, and that warnings from civil servants may have been dismissed. If true, this paints a picture of a government that didn't accidentally stray across legal boundaries. This was a government that knew exactly where those boundaries were and chose to cross them anyway, gambling that they wouldn't get caught or that they were powerful enough to weather any consequences. The timing couldn't be worse for Starmer. His government was already facing mounting pressure on multiple fronts. Economic challenges, public service crises, and growing discontent among voters had already weakened his position. This Supreme Court ruling doesn't just add to his problems, it fundamentally undermines his authority to govern. How can a Prime Minister who has been found to have acted unlawfully command the confidence of Parliament? How can he stand at the dispatch box and lecture others about following the rules when his own government has been caught breaking them at the highest level? The answer is simple. He can't. Not with any credibility, not with any moral authority. Opposition leaders have been absolutely ruthless in their response, and who can blame them? This is the kind of political ammunition that comes along once in a generation. Press conferences have been dominated by demands for accountability, calls for inquiries, and pointed questions about what else the government might be hiding. If they were willing to act unlawfully in this instance, what other decisions might not stand up to legal scrutiny? What other policies might crumble if subjected to proper judicial review? The questions are piling up faster than the government can possibly answer them, and each unanswered question erodes public trust just a little bit more. The media has gone into absolute overdrive. Front pages across the country have been brutal. Editorial boards that once gave Starmer the benefit of the doubt are now openly questioning whether he's fit to continue as Prime Minister. Political commentators who built their careers on measured, balanced analysis are using words like catastrophic, devastating, and unprecedented. This isn't partisan hysteria. This is a genuine constitutional crisis that threatens the very foundations of how Britain is governed. When the Supreme Court declares government actions unlawful, it's not a political game. It's a fundamental statement that something has gone seriously, dangerously wrong at the heart of power. But let's dig deeper into what this actually means for ordinary people like you. This isn't just some abstract legal battle happening in ivory towers and courtrooms. This ruling has real, tangible consequences for everyone living under this government's authority. When the Supreme Court declares government actions unlawful, it means that decisions affecting your life, your family, your future were made illegally. Think about that. Policies that may have impacted your job, your healthcare, your children's education, your financial security were implemented by a government that the highest court in the land has now ruled was acting outside the law. Those decisions don't automatically disappear, but their legitimacy is now permanently tainted. The legal chaos this creates is almost unprecedented in modern British history. Lawyers are already examining which other government policies might be vulnerable to legal challenge based on similar reasoning to what the Supreme Court used in this case. If the government got it wrong here, where else did they get it wrong? How many other decisions are sitting on shaky legal foundations, just waiting for someone to bring a case that could bring them tumbling down? The uncertainty is enormous, and uncertainty is absolutely toxic for good governance. Businesses need stable, predictable legal frameworks to make investment decisions. Citizens need to know that the laws governing their lives are legitimate and enforceable. This ruling has thrown all of that into question. What's particularly troubling is how the government responded when initially challenged on these issues. They didn't engage in good faith debate. They didn't carefully reconsider their position. They doubled down. They fought the legal challenge every step of the way, spending enormous amounts of taxpayer money on lawyers to defend the indefensible. They were so convinced they were right, so certain of their power, that they took it all the way to the Supreme Court, only to suffer a humiliating and total defeat. The arrogance is staggering. The waste of public resources is unconscionable, and the damage to public trust may be irreparable. Inside Westminster, the mood is absolutely toxic. Government MPS are facing a nightmare scenario. They're being hammered in their constituencies by angry voters who feel betrayed. They're facing brutal questioning from local media who want to know how their representative could support a government that acts unlawfully. And they're getting absolutely no cover from Downing Street, which has been paralysed by the scale of the crisis. The carefully crafted talking points that usually flow from party headquarters have been notably absent. What can they possibly say? How do you spin a Supreme Court ruling that declares your government unlawful? You can't. And the silence is deafening. Behind the scenes, according to well-placed sources, there have been furious arguments about who is to blame. Fingers are being pointed in every direction. Some are blaming the Attorney General for providing bad legal advice. Others are blaming senior ministers for pushing ahead despite warnings. Still others are pointing directly at Starmer himself for creating a culture where legal concerns were dismissed if they got in the way of political objectives. The blame game is in full swing. But here's the thing, it doesn't actually matter who specifically is at fault. This happened on Starmer's watch. This happened under his leadership. In parliamentary democracy, the buck stops at the top, and right now the top is looking extremely vulnerable. The constitutional scholars and legal experts have been having a field day analysing the judgment in detail. What emerges from their analysis is even more damning than the headlines suggest. The Supreme Court didn't just find a technical legal error that could be easily corrected. They identified fundamental flaws in how the government approached its responsibilities. They pointed to a disregard for established legal principles. They highlighted failures to properly consider the rights and interests of those affected by the decisions. This wasn't incompetence. This was, in the court's carefully worded but unmistakable language, a government that prioritised its political goals over its legal obligations. That is a devastating indictment of how Starmer runs his government. Public opinion has shifted dramatically in the wake of the ruling. Polling conducted immediately after the judgment was announced shows a massive drop in trust in the government. People who voted for Starmer expecting competent, lawful governance are feeling betrayed. The social media reaction has been absolutely savage, with the hashtag related to the case trending for days. But it's not just online outrage. Town halls and constituency meetings are reportedly turning hostile. MPS are being confronted by constituents demanding answers they simply cannot provide. The disconnect between the government and the people it's supposed to serve has never been wider, and it's growing by the day. What makes this even more politically toxic is the hypocrisy it exposes. Starmer built his political career on his credentials as a former director of public prosecutions. He positioned himself as Mr. Law and Order, the safe pair of hands who would restore integrity to government after years of scandal and chaos. That entire brand, that entire political identity has been shattered by this ruling. How can someone who championed the rule of law preside over a government that breaks it? The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming, and voters are not forgiving. The very thing that was supposed to be Starmer's greatest strength has become his most glaring weakness. The international dimension of this crisis cannot be ignored either. Britain's reputation on the world stage has taken a serious hit. Foreign governments and international investors watch these things very carefully. When a country's Supreme Court declares its government unlawful, it raises red flags about stability, reliability, and the strength of democratic institutions. Diplomats in foreign capitals are briefing their governments about the situation, assessing what it means for bilateral relations and international agreements. Business leaders are questioning whether Britain remains a stable environment for investment. The damage extends far beyond Westminster. This is a national embarrassment that will have consequences for years to come. Opposition parties are naturally seizing the moment with both hands. They've united in a way rarely seen in British politics, putting aside their own differences to focus laser-like attention on the government's failures. Emergency debates have been scheduled. Parliamentary questions are being tabled by the dozen. Select committees are launching inquiries. The machinery of parliamentary accountability has roared into life, and the government is being subjected to scrutiny like never before. Ministers who once strutted confidently through the corridors of power now look hunted, constantly on the defensive, always one question away from another damaging admission. The legal community has been particularly vocal in its criticism. Barristers, solicitors, and legal academics who normally stay out of political debates have felt compelled to speak out. They've expressed alarm not just at the specific ruling, but at what it reveals about the government's attitude toward the law. Several prominent legal figures have written open letters calling for reforms to ensure this can never happen again. Professional bodies have issued statements emphasising the fundamental importance of government operating within the law. This isn't political point scoring, this is genuine concern from people who have dedicated their lives to the legal system about a government that appears to have treated that system with contempt. Inside the civil service, there's reportedly a mixture of vindication and concern. Civil servants who raised warnings that were ignored now feel their fears have been proven entirely justified, but there's no satisfaction in being right when the cost is a constitutional crisis. Many are worried about the long-term damage to the machinery of government. When ministers ignore legal advice and press ahead regardless, it undermines the entire system of checks and balances that's supposed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. Civil servants are supposed to provide fearless advice and ministers are supposed to listen to it, especially on legal matters. If that relationship has broken down, as this case suggests it has, then the problem goes much deeper than one bad decision. The economic implications are starting to become clear as well. Markets don't like uncertainty, and this ruling has created enormous uncertainty about the stability and legitimacy of government policy. The pound took a noticeable hit when the judgment was announced. Business confidence indicators have declined. Investment decisions are being put on hold while companies wait to see how the crisis plays out. None of this is catastrophic in itself, but it's death by 1,000 cuts. Each small negative consequence adds up. Each bit of damage compounds the rest. And all of it was entirely avoidable if the government had simply followed the law in the first place. Trade unions and civil society organisations have also weighed in, many of them expressing fury at a government that lectures working people about following the rules while breaking them itself. There's a deep sense of one rule for them, another rule for us that has taken hold. When ordinary people break the law, they face consequences. When the government breaks the law, what happens? Do ministers resign? Do they face sanctions? Or do they simply express regret and carry on as if nothing happened? The answer to that question will define not just Starmer's premiership, but the entire political culture for years to come. The pressure for resignations has been relentless. Opposition leaders have been crystal clear. They want heads to roll. They want accountability. They want someone to take responsibility for this disaster. But so far, Starmer has resisted calls to sack anyone or to resign himself. He's hunkered down, hoping to ride out the storm. But political storms of this magnitude don't just blow over, they intensify, they consume, they destroy. And with each day that passes without accountability, the pressure builds, the anger grows, the political price gets higher. At some point, something has to give. The only question is what breaks first, the Prime Minister's resolve or his government's authority? What's particularly fascinating from a political standpoint is how this has reshuffled alliances and calculations across the entire political spectrum. Some of Starmer's own backbenchers are reportedly having serious conversations about whether he can continue. These aren't the usual suspects, the serial rebels who oppose everything. These are previously loyal supporters who are genuinely shocked by the Supreme Court ruling and worried about what it means for their own political futures. Nobody wants to go down with a sinking ship, and right now the government looks very much like it's taking on water. The whispered conversations in tea rooms and corridors are all about the same thing. How long can Starmer survive? And if he goes, who replaces him? The historical parallels are being drawn constantly. Political historians are comparing this to previous constitutional crises, looking for precedents and patterns. What they're finding is not reassuring for Starmer. Governments that suffer this kind of legal humiliation rarely recover their authority. The damage to credibility is simply too severe. Once the Supreme Court has declared you unlawful, that stain doesn't wash out. It becomes part of your legacy, part of how history remembers you. And history is not kind to leaders who break the laws they're supposed to uphold.